Okay, welcome back. This is lecture number 2, Central European Monarchs Clash. Dun dun dun. Okay, so we have already learned about absolute monarchs in places like Spain and France who used divine right to rule their subjects completely. Now we're going to learn about monarchs in Central Europe, in places that made up what used to be known as the Holy Roman Empire, including places like what we now call Austria. Yeah. We'll also learn about a German state called Prussia. Sounds like Russia, but we'll get there. Okay, so last unit we learned all about the Protestant Reformation in Europe and how the Catholic Church split even further, resulting in a variety of Christian denominations. Much of these changes were the indirect result of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg chapel door. Well, an unfortunate result of these new denominations within Christianity included religious wars. Evidently, religious beliefs often clash and can result in hurt feelings and war, amongst other things. So, yes, nowhere was this more apparent than in the former Holy Roman Empire, which had pretty much fallen apart by the mid-1500s. Instead, there were many different states, kind of like mini-countries in places like Germany, where individual princes ruled. These princes often fought one another over religious issues. In fact, the princes all signed a truce with one another, which became known as the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Under this truce, princes could decide if they wanted to practice Protestantism in their state or Catholicism. Basically, it was their call, and they got to decide, which is why if you go to Germany today, there are some regions in Germany where Protestantism is the predominant religion. In other places, like Dusseldorf, Catholicism is widely practiced. Anyway, so you've got pockets of different religions there. Okay, so pretty soon, Catholic princes started aligning themselves with other Catholic princes. Protestant princes began aligning themselves with Protestant princes. They basically formed their own alliances, and war seemed on the horizon. Additionally, a famous ruling family called the Habsburg family had been ruling the Holy Roman Empire, and they didn't like that these individual princes in the Holy Roman states were threatening the Habsburg monopoly of power over the region. Basically, a war called the 30 Years' War took place from 1618 to 1648. Ruling families fought each other for control of Central Europe. Even France sent troops and supplies to help the Protestants fight against the Habsburgs, their enemy. The result of this conflict was the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty ended up weakening the Habsburg control over Central Europe and gave France quite a bit of German territory. They granted German princes independence from the Holy Roman Empire and ended many religious wars in Europe. And this was the first time in Europe following a war when all the war leaders met to discuss the outcomes of the war. This is something still done today, so stay tuned. The Peace of Westphalia also marked the beginning of the creation of independent countries in Central Europe. Let me repeat that so that you know it's important. The 30 Years' War and the subsequent treaty that marked its end, the Peace of Westphalia, marked the beginning of a modern European map. Yeah, a Catholic-led Holy Roman Empire was no more, technically, and in its place were small, independent German states, each led by a prince or king. So, Central European nation-states were slower to get rid of the feudal system. In Western Europe, many peasants or serfs had moved to cities or won their freedom from their lords and no longer depended on a manor way of life. In Central Europe, many nobles didn't want to lose their hold over serfs, so they passed laws that restricted the serfs' ability to move around freely. See, Central European nobles needed people to work the land so then that they could sell the crops that they made to Western Europe, etc. Another difference between Central and Western Europe by the 1600s, the countries that formed were stronger and weaker that didn't make any sense at all. Anyway, the countries that formed in Western Europe were stronger than the weaker ones. Okay, you know what, Mrs. Moll is totally messing up, and I do not want to start this lecture, but I realize that what I've written here doesn't make any sense, so let's just start that again, all right? Great. So Central Europe was different than Western Europe by the 1600s in that countries like Spain and France were much stronger than the Central European countries that were forming. And nobles in Central Europe didn't want kings controlling them. So this was another difference between Central Europe and Western Europe, is that you're not going to see the same sorts of kings emerging as in Western Europe. And they didn't want to see their nations turn to absolute monarchy. All right, so most Central European nations during the 1600s didn't have strong rulers like France and Spain. That's ultimately what I was trying to say before I messed up. Because, they were trying desperately to hold on to this whole idea of feudalism. Additionally, the Holy Roman Empire and Ottoman Empire had both weakened considerably by the 1600s. Two primary families are going to take advantage of these weakened empires in order to maintain their own power. These included the Habsburgs of Austria. Strong monarchs emerged from the Habsburg family and began controlling Austria, which included many different ethnic groups like Czechs, Hungarians, Italians, Croatians, as well as Germans. The Habsburgs had actually taken a lot of land from the Ottomans, including Hungary and part of the Balkan Peninsula. We're going to talk a lot about the Balkan Peninsula as we lead up to World War I. Oh, yes. Because Habsburg rule over such a diverse region is going to have some profound effects on people's attitudes there. Oh, yes. But more on that later. Bottom line, Austria will emerge as a diverse territory with a strong monarch. One of the most famous Habsburg Austrian monarchs was Maria Theresa, whose dad had set up a cushy monarchy for her by making her the sole heir to all of the Austrian lands. This actually made a German state called Prussia as well. This actually made a German state, which was called Prussia, made them pretty upset or fairly peeved. See, Maria Theresa was considered an enlightened despot, meaning that although she ruled absolutely and had a great deal of power, she also believed in giving her people a great deal of freedom. She did things like freed the serfs in Austria, which angered the nobles. But she did a good job of putting her foot down on the nobles, and she took away much of their power to control the nation. Now, the other German state that became super powerful was Prussia. Yeah, I know, it sounds like Russia. Listen, don't get confused. Prussia doesn't exist anymore. Prussia included land that we now call Poland, Germany, and parts of Ukraine, which is next to Russia. So its name actually sounds like some of the territory it controlled. Prussia will only exist in Europe until around 1871, when Germany actually became a nation, and following a war between Prussia and France called the Franco-Prussian War. France got its booty kicked by the Prussians, and France never forgave them for this sound beating. But more on the subsequent animosity between those two nations later. So yes, Prussia was a really powerful nation-state right next to Austria. They had a powerful ruling family called the Hohenzollern. Now, I just totally butchered that. I'm going to refer to my German friend right now to help me with this pronunciation. Is this Hohenzollern?
Hohenzollern.
Okay, did you hear that? Let's say that one more time, Hannah, please.
Hohenzollern.
Right. So I'm just going to say the Hohenzollern. Look on your word list. I'm butchering the term, but you heard the correct pronunciation. Anyway, the Hohenzollerns controlled the Junkers, or the nobles, in Prussia, by giving them almost complete control over the military and by allowing them to gain territory in Prussia. In exchange, the nobles allowed themselves to be controlled by a powerful king. One of their most well-known kings was Frederick the Great, also known as Frederick II. What's with all these numbers after the names? Man, Frederick the Great, just remember that. Anyway, Frederick the Great and Maria Theresa of Austria didn't get along per se. They had a conflict with one another called the War of Austrian Succession. This conflict began when Frederick tried to take part of Austria's territory. You know, Frederick assumed that Maria Theresa was a weak woman and that she wouldn't put up a fight. He was so wrong. Maria Theresa was a tough cookie. She had just had a baby, and I'm pretty sure she ended up with at least 16 kids with her hubby, who was Francis I of the Holy Roman Empire. And man, 16 kids, woo! Anyway, she had just had a baby when he attacked her country. And so she traveled to Hungary with her newborn in her arms, and she was able to get her peasants to band together and support her efforts to get the Prussians out. You know, she wasn't completely successful and actually had to give up some of the territory to Frederick the Great of Prussia, but she held her ground and gained support and respect. Prussia, however, became an even bigger and more aggressive power in Europe. The War of Austrian Succession set the stage for, write this down, it set the stage for alliances in Europe. Maria Theresa joined an alliance with France. Ooh, this upset Prussia, so they signed an alliance with Austria's former BFF, Britain. Think England. This is going to lead to a conflict amongst the powers of Europe called the 7 Years' War. It didn't lead to much territorial change in Europe, but it did lead to a future Europe that was dependent on the formation of alliances. And this will be something played out again and again as we make our way towards 1914 and World War I. All right, thanks for listening. Bye.
Hi, my name is John Green. This is Crash Course World History. Oh my gosh! Today we're going to talk about war. Explosions everywhere! So traditionally, historians are pretty keen on wars because they feature clearly delineated beginnings and middles and ends, and because they always have a fair bit of death and drama and mortally wounded generals who have great last words like, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of those trees." Whereas the last words of plague victims are always like, Sorry, plague victims. As if you don't have enough troubles, now you've got me teasing you about your uninspired death throes. Wars have easy whens, wheres, whos, and whys. 1861 to 1865. The United States, the North versus the South to end slavery and save the Union. Mr. Green, are you going to show us the hidden complexities behind something we already think we understand again? Sorry, me from the past, but yes. However, to placate you, here are some more explosions. Boom, 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 boom. The 17th and 18th century saw a bunch of top-notch wars, but today we're going to focus on the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian Wars, because it was the first truly global war. In fact, no less a historian than Winston Churchill called it the First World War. But we've been so Eurocentric here on Crash Course that all we are going to say about the entire war in Europe is that Prussia and Great Britain fought France and Austria, and that the Austrian Habsburgs wanted to win back Silesia, which they failed to do. There! That's all you get, Europe! So the 7 Years' War lasted for anyone? 23 years? I hate you, me from the past. But as it happens, by sheer coincidence, you are not necessarily wrong.